Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our third and final distinguished seminar presented by the CEE DEI Committee and the Pelham Scholars Program. Today's talk is titled Redefine Engineering, Equity and Inclusion in Education, Research and Practice. Once again, I would like to start by acknowledging that the University of Michigan began with land ceded by the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples in 1817. And since our mission and that of our invited speaker is education, it is important to recognize that the land was ceded based on the understanding that Native American people would be educated at the University of Michigan. Now, that didn't happen until 130 years after the university's founding. We in CEE affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold U of M more accountable in sustaining mutually beneficial partnerships with Indigenous peoples. Now with that, I would like to introduce our invited speaker, Professor Yvette Pearson, who is Associate Dean for Accreditation, Assessment, and Strategic Initiatives in the George R. Brown School of Engineering, at Rice University, and founder of the Peer Group. Dr. Pearson is a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers and is recognized globally for 25 years of contributions to engineering education, particularly for her work along the intersections of sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is inaugural chair of ASCE's board-level committee, Mosaic, which is charged with leading the society in all matters of DEI for the profession. As past vice chair of the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, she was part of the team that first introduced DEI into ASCE's Code of Ethics, providing leadership for the principle that requires engineers to consider the diversity of communities they serve and to include diverse perspectives in planning and design. Among her awards are Yvette's Claire L. Felbinger Award for Diversity and Inclusion, ASCE's Professional Practice Ethics and Leadership Award, and the University of Texas Regents Outstanding Teaching Award. Dr. Pearson is a registered professional engineer, a commissioner on ABET's Engineering Accreditation Commission, and host of Engineering Change podcast, which has listeners around the globe. We are delighted to have the chance to hear from Dr. Pearson today. I do want to also note that we want to make our event accessible to all participants. This webinar will have live automated captions and a transcript will be available. To choose a viewing option, click Live Transcript on the control bar at the bottom of your screen, where you can show or hide the subtitles. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our guest. Welcome, Dr. Pearson.
Thank you so much, Dr. McBean, and thank you for having me. I was originally supposed to be here in February, and as most, if not all of you know, I'm sure, we had a tremendous, what was considered for Texas, a tremendous winter storm that was just a day in the life for folks in Michigan, but it literally shut us down for a week or more. And so we were having intermittent power outages, and I'm happy that you were able to reschedule me and to get me in here to bring up the rear. Now I have the added pressure of coming behind two dynamic talks by Drs. Montfort and also Dr. Simmons. And so I will do my best to do this justice. I want to talk about this concept of redefine. I created the redefine framework several years ago, just sort of thinking about what we need in engineering education and in engineering more broadly to better address issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so even though the title I sent to you all was focused on equity and inclusion, I was trying not to have it be too long, but it's very important that we recognize as engineers our responsibilities also to justice. And so I'll speak to you today a bit about my concepts and some of my work around the framework of redefine engineering, looking at JEDI in education, research, and practice. I want to start first with looking at the numbers. Everybody typically starts these types of talks with the numbers, and I hope to put a bit of a different spin on it. If we look at data published by the National Science Foundation, and this data in particular is for women earning BS degrees in engineering, comparing 1997 to 2016. If we're looking at raw numbers, we would think we're making progress because the numbers have pretty much doubled from 11,500 degrees earned in 1997 to 22,800 degrees earned in 2016. But when you look at those numbers as a fraction of the overall number of degrees earned, you can see there has been very little progress indeed, from 18.4% in 1997 to 20.9% in 2016. So the needle really, really has not moved much. And then if we go another step and look at people of color in engineering, and then specifically we pull out Blacks and African Americans, we see again an increase, an ever so small increase in number, from 3,077 degrees earned, and this is BS degrees earned in engineering in 1997, compared to 4,206 in 2016. And when we look at the overall percentages, we've gone backwards from 4.9% to 3.9% over that same time period. And when you look to try to look at the outcomes for other identities, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ identities, socioeconomic identities, various socioeconomic identities, the data isn't so easy to come by. And so it's just, and a lot of times not even on the radar or not even counted. But just looking at these stats on women and Blacks and African Americans, you can see that there's more that needs to be done. We've seen over the decades tons of investment of time, resources, millions, if not billions of dollars in efforts toward broadening participation, or as NSF now refers to it as full participation of people from traditionally marginalized identities, but we're not seeing the change. And I like to think of 3 broad reasons why I believe diversity efforts fail. And notice I have here 3 of the reasons, because I really believe there are more, but at the high level, this is where I think a lot of it sits. One reason is that diversity efforts are often what I call relegated and delegated. So they're relegated to the margins of what we do, especially in engineering. Diversity is stuff that folks do over there somewhere. We haven't really embraced it and integrated it into the way that we educate and into the way we practice and research in engineering. And then it's also often delegated to the people from the traditionally marginalized identities, the people who didn't create the problems in the first place, and usually the people who are not in the positions of power to make changes. And so with that relegation and delegation, we don't see the needle move. A second reason why I believe diversity efforts fail is because a lot of people have limited perspectives on what diversity means, especially again in engineering, and I'll say in civil engineering. A lot of times you'll see a narrow focus on women that usually translates to white women, and nothing wrong with that, but we can't ignore that the experiences of women of color, for instance, are quite different from the experiences of our white women colleagues. We can't ignore that the experiences of people of color or people in the LGBTQ community or people with disabilities are quite different. And so we have to be able to, when we're considering diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to consider all the groups impacted and consider how disparate the outcomes are amongst the groups and how those are exacerbated if people have multiple intersectional traditionally marginalized identities. For me, as a Black woman with a disability, my experiences and some of the things I face are going to be quite different from my white male colleagues or even my Black men colleagues. And so we have to not narrow our perspectives on who we are trying to include. It's about including everybody. And a third reason why I believe diversity efforts fail is that they focus only on diversity. And by that, I mean, people are looking at the numbers, which we need. I'm not knocking that at all. I started this talk at the numbers because we do need representation in engineering that looks like all of society. So the numbers are important. But what I mean by diversity efforts failing because of focusing only on diversity is that when we focus on just the numbers and then we don't pay attention to the underlying root causes of the challenges with the numbers, we will not be able to create and sustain the diversity we're trying to achieve. So for that reason, I like to think of these sorts of efforts as building blocks, starting with the foundation of justice that says we need to identify and get rid of, fix whatever we have to do so that we can eliminate the policies and the practices that have created the inequities and perpetuated them for over such a long period of time. So we start with that foundation of justice. And then we move up a building block, add another building block of equity. And equity says that we treat everybody with dignity, respect, and fairness. Everybody. Inclusion is the next building block, and that says it's not enough to have the different people in the room and different people at the table. We need to hear and value their voices, and we need to make sure their perspectives are valued and included. And on top of that is the building block of diversity. And so where you see if you can see the way that the building blocks are stacked, if I pull any of the ones away, justice, if I pull justice away, equity, inclusion, and diversity cannot stand. If I pull equity away, inclusion and diversity will topple over. And so in order to create and sustain diversity, we have to have the building blocks of justice, equity, and inclusion to support it. So that gets us to this framework of redefine engineering, and we'll spend a few minutes there. Redefine engineering is starting with re-image. We need to re-image who we see as engineers and what we see as engineering. Dr. Simmons and I co-authored or co-guest edited a special issue of a journal a couple of years back. And we talked about in our editorial about how we put ourselves out there as problem solvers, engineers. Engineers are problem solvers. And we often leave off the other very important part, and that's people. So engineers solve problems for people. And so as we think about how to re-image engineering, we need to make sure the people part is on our radar. So I'll spend a little time talking about that. De-silo our academic programs, our research, and our approach to problem solving overall. So we re-image who we see as engineers, what we see as engineering, de-silo academic programs, research, and our approach to problem solving, and fine-tune our culture and climate so everyone can succeed. And through doing these three things, we get at each of those building blocks of JEDI. So let's start with re-image. When I first created the REDEFINE framework, I did and this was probably about 5 years or so ago, maybe even before then. I did a Google search of engineering, and I did another Google image search of engineers. And so when I looked at engineering, I came up with all sorts of inanimate objects, computers, squiggly lines on computer screens, um, gears, all sorts of things that may have been related to engineering. But if I put on the hat of a person who really didn't know what engineering was about, and I tried to do this search to just try to capture a visual, or even get to a web page that might get me more information about engineering, none of that um, none of that really registered in terms of what engineers really do. And certainly none of it made any connections to people. Along with that, I did um, or actually it was a couple of years before that, I had done during one of my outreach activities and exercise. It was an outreach activity with young girls, and I put a bunch of post-it posters on the walls around the room, and I drew different axes on them. So on the axes, I would label uh, opposites. So I would label something like team player, not a team player, good communicator, not a good communicator, helps people, does not help people. And I gave the young women a package of colored dots and explained the charts to them and asked them to go and put the dots on the posters where they felt engineers fell. What did they feel were characteristics of engineers? Can anybody guess where those dots fell? Largely, they fell in the quadrants that said we were not good communicators, we did not help people, we were not team players. They had a perception of engineers as being these folks who worked in cubby holes by doing something that nobody ever would understand and that we couldn't communicate to anybody. And so that image is something we have to change. Now, I'll say fast forward in probably within the last year, I've redone that Google search, and I think I at least saw a hand in one of the pictures related to engineering. So we're getting closer to the human connections. But all jokes aside, I really believe that outside, outside of the bioengineering and the environmental engineering that have such clear connections to humanity, we need to do a better job of presenting our image. And along with that, so I believe that in itself will help attract people from more diverse groups to engineering. But along with that, we have to re-image who we see as engineers. I share with people all the time. One of the things that has driven my passion for the work that I do is to try to prevent any young Yvette from falling through the cracks of our systems. Because if you go back to 1988, when I was graduating high school, and you look at Yvette Pearson on paper, that was not a person that anybody except my mother at the time thought would be a successful engineer. So obviously there's potential that shows up that doesn't necessarily show up in the traditional ways. And so we need to really look at how we image that, how we determine who has the potential. And quite honestly, a lot of it lies within the individual. And so re-image who we see as engineers. Don't automatically look at somebody and count them out. By the same token, we don't want to automatically look at people and assume anything about them. So some conversations I've had, for instance, with colleagues who are women engineers, and specifically Black women engineers, there's this perception that they struggled in math or they had this hard time. No, that's not the case with everybody. So we have to change this framing around what we think of as potential and who has it and who doesn't. So re-image who we see as engineers and what we see as engineering. Then we de-silo our academic programs, our research, and our approach to problem solving. Back in 2014, the National Research Council, which is within the National Academies, published a report on convergence, which talked about bringing together science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine disciplines to focus on societal problems. NSF adopted convergence as one of its 10 big ideas, I want to say around the same time, maybe the 2015 timeframe. And through some of its flagship programs like the Engineering Research Centers, ERC for short, really took the concept of convergence to another level. First of all, they expanded the disciplines and said it's not enough to just look at the traditional STEM disciplines in medicine, but we also need to make sure we're including other STEM disciplines like the social and behavioral sciences. We need to make sure policy, economics, business, all of these different areas, humanities and so forth, and community perspectives, problem solving. And it's not enough to just bring folks together. We've been talking about multidisciplinary research for a long time, but by and large, it's still been done in a siloed manner where maybe the engineers do this here and the computing folks do this here. And so with convergence and the way that NSF is really focusing on it, is bringing together the different ways of doing, thinking, and knowing from all of these different disciplines and from all facets of stakeholders to make sure that our approach to problem solving is really comprehensive and inclusive. And I always say it like this. Going back to our statement earlier about engineers are problem solvers and we solve problems for people. We cannot effectively solve problems for a heterogeneous society with homogeneous problem solvers. And I think for a long time, especially as engineers, and I'm speaking of myself, and as engineering faculty and administrators and so forth, we've always tried to sort of figure out how we can do things ourselves. And we really need to rely upon, value, and respect the expertise that our colleagues from various disciplines bring to the table. And there's an opportunity to do that not only in research, but also in our curricula. Look at how we can create courses around the really user-centered design and how we bring in the people aspects of that. And so de-siloing our academic programs, problem solving, and our approach to research. And then fine-tune our culture and climate so everyone can succeed. And again, this gets back to that concept of JEDI. We talk a lot about recruiting people from diverse backgrounds, whether it's students, undergraduate or graduate students, faculty, staff, but it does no good to bring them in and the climate and culture is toxic so that they either will suffer through it, which many of us have done in a lot of places, or we'll go somewhere else where it's a healthier climate. So while we do, again, need to focus on that D, the diversity, we need to focus on the JEI to make sure our climate and culture are conducive to everybody's success. And that starts with, first of all, looking at, and I'm thinking right now from a hiring point of view, but there are a lot of different angles to approach this from. But from a hiring standpoint, who are you bringing in? The people create the culture. So are you bringing in people who are going to contribute to the culture and climate you're cultivating? Are you bringing in people who are going to be counter to that? So start there. Are there things in your processes? There barriers in your processes, whether it's for undergraduate or graduate admissions or for recruitment and hiring, that's keeping people from getting to the next step? Are there biases that show up in identifying who is the best person? Are there biases that show up that keep people from getting to the interview? I had a conversation with a faculty member after a talk a couple of years ago, and he came up afterwards and asked, well, first he stated, you know, my university requires us to have at least one underrepresented minority or one woman in the final 4 folks that we bring to campus for interviews. And his question was, how do I justify moving someone who's 15th or 16th on the list to 3rd or 4th so that we can say we have this minority or woman in the interview pool? My response to him was, you're asking the wrong question. Surely not all women and minorities should end up 15th and 16th or 49th and 50th or whatever on your list. So the question you should be asking is why that is occurring. Because if you fix that part, the other part will rectify itself. You know, and it kind of goes back to the Rooney Rule in football. And I'm not a sports enthusiast or whatever, but my best friend is. And I didn't even know what the Rooney Rule was until we had this conversation. But he pointed out the very same sort of rule. We have to have a Black coach in the final candidates for a head coach. But you haven't seen the needle move at all with respect to the number of Black coaches in the NFL. And it's the same sort of thing with our hiring. It's not that folks aren't qualified. It's not that we don't exist. There's something else blocking the funnel. And that something else has to do with the inequities that are in the system. So that's a part of that fine-tune the climate and culture. We can say the same thing on the student sides of things. There are students, when students come in, and they come in from a system, a K-12 system that is under-resourced compared to the more affluent systems, such that the students' opportunities are limited. Somehow that translates to some people on our campuses as the student has a limitation, the student has a deficit, without recognizing that's not it at all. The student has tons of potential. The system failed. And so we need to fix the systems. We're not fixing people, we're fixing systems. So re-image who we see as engineers, what we see as engineering, de-silo our academic programs, research, and approaches to problem solving, and fine-tune our culture and climate so everyone can succeed. In doing that, we are certain to face challenges. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. You wouldn't be having this speaker series. Everything would be just as it should be. But the truth is, there are challenges. And I think of challenges in terms of hurdles and barriers. Hurdles are designed to be overcome. Barriers impede progress. So as a wheelchair user, if I encounter a 4-inch curb trying to get on the sidewalk and there's no curb cut, that's a barrier. That's going to stop me in my tracks. And I want you to be very attentive to what I'm about to say next, because I don't want anybody to take this out of context. Now, when it comes to barriers, as leaders, and I emphasize as leaders in this space, it is our responsibility to try to remove and eliminate or reduce barriers to the extent that we can. Now, personally, for me, as a wheelchair user, I might, as an individual, because I do have the physical ability, although it will be very hard, I might overcome that barrier by using a crutch to stand up and then dragging my chair up onto the curb. Now, I offered the caution before I made that statement, because what I don't want to come out of this conversation is a sense of get over it. Because in the space of Jedi in education, too long we've had educators who've had that mentality. Oh, we'll just get over it, especially with related to students with disabilities, and especially invisible disabilities. Figure it out, work it out. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, as leaders, it's up to us. So in the case, going back to the curb, as a leader, I need to make a phone call to get somebody to come in and put in a curb cut, because it's my responsibility as a leader to remove that barrier. So hurdles and barriers, we try to, as leaders, make as many barriers into hurdles, or remove them altogether as possible. And there are a lot of challenges that come with that, because there's a lot of change that needs to occur. And there are just challenges that just come with the job of change. One challenge is the mirror. You know, some people like selfies and looking in the mirror and everything, others don't. And by the mirror in this case, I'm meaning the mirror that tells us what we look like, good or bad. And oftentimes we don't want to necessarily look and see the bad that's there. And it is hard. It's very difficult, but it's very necessary in order to fix. You cannot solve problems that you cannot acknowledge. So you have to take the look in the mirror and determine what's not working to be able to address it. Another challenge with change is speed, or the lack thereof, meaning that change is a process. And if it's done well, it's going to get, again, at the roots of the inequities. It's not going to come and put Band-Aids on stuff that are going to burst open and bleed again. It's going to get at the roots. And that takes time. It takes time to understand what those roots are. And it takes time to strategize about how to do those things. And then the action and the improvement and everything. And I'll talk about that process in a minute, but it takes time. And so you're going to have people that say, you're taking too long. Why don't I see something happening? And then you're going to have people who might be a bit risk averse and a little averse to change, who feel like no matter what you do, you're taking them a bit too fast. Why is this happening so quickly? And so there is a delicate balance that has to be reached with change, to say that, you know, there are some quick wins that we can get, that we can show up front, that people are heard, that their voices are valued, and we can get some things in motion on a quicker order, but also be attentive to communicate what's going on behind the scenes that people don't necessarily see, and it is taking time to get done. Another challenge with change is pain, and that arrives with a couple of different flavors. One is that getting to the pain point, understanding what really matters, what is that pain we're trying to fix. You know, you don't want to go to the doctor for hip pain and they do something to fix your shoulder. So identifying what's the pain point, what's the pain level, and what we need to address. And then the other part of the pain is, once you start doing that, there's a whole nother level of pain, because again, none of this comes easily. I think about, you know, major surgery that I had to replace my hip. The doctor goes in, cuts down into the bone and tears my muscles apart and everything else. And then the next day after they've sewn me up, they send therapists to tell me to stand up and try to take a step. Really? You want me to do what? But ultimately, that pain and the fixing the bandages and attending to the stitches and going through the pain that comes with that therapy gets you to the other side. And so that's another part of the pain. Again, change is not easy and it does get hard, but you have to push through it to get to the other side. Legal challenges and politics and all of that also come into play, especially when you start to talk about strategies to improve success for people from underrepresented groups. Folks are going to raise challenges to say, well, you're keeping me away from opportunities by focusing on these folks. We saw it in the last presidential administration. I had people calling me about projects I'm on advisory boards for that are funded by NSF and saying, okay, if we do a training related to diversity and we say the word racism, are we going to get our funding taken away? And these sorts of things are very real challenges. And so that's why the partnerships are important. Being able to work with people and, you know, on your campuses, working with legal counsel and your different offices of access, equal opportunity, and those places have to be part of what's going on. And finally, I think one of the biggest challenges with change is the way we've always done it. You know, I'm satisfied. I'm good where I am. So why should I worry about it? This is the way we've always done it. Or telling that new person who comes in, because so many people are now recruiting people who are focused on JEDI for the organizations. And that new person coming in is told, hey, that's just not the way we do things here. That's one of the biggest challenges with change. So I tend to be a very process-oriented person. So another sort of process, continuous improvement process that I use in my work and just in general is what I brand as MESA. So measure, evaluate, strategize, and act. We measure to understand what's going on. So that's looking at the data, whether it's existing data or collecting new data. We might be looking at time to degree completion, attrition and retention, promotion and tenure, salary equities. We might be looking at a number of different things to understand what's going on. We could use qualitative data like interviews and focus groups to dig not only into the what, but the why, which takes us into the evaluate, because we have to understand why we see what we see. It's not enough just to see disparities in numbers. We have to understand why those things occur. And in evaluating, we also want to set benchmarks for where we want to be. And then we can S, which is strategize, so that those strategies specifically address the why, the problem, the root cause, and then we act. And then this is a continuous cycle. And it's not necessarily linear like it lays out here. You might have little mini cycles within the cycle. So you might have a cycle of measure, evaluate, measure, evaluate. You might have an evaluate, strategize, and try to figure it all out. But ultimately, it's a continuous improvement process that we need to really effect longstanding change. And when you're in a position of needing to lead change, embarking upon this journey that, as I mentioned, is just a very difficult one, these are some key things I think you need. First of all, to listen to people, to listen to their experiences, and to learn how differently people might be experiencing the climate and culture just because of how they show up or who they show up as, just because of their identities. I was speaking with a young person I mentor, and they're the only, and I'm choosing my words very carefully because I don't want to risk identifying anybody, but they're the only in their place of employment. Okay. They faced such harassing behavior. When they told me about it, my first question to them was, have you contacted the police? That's how bad it was. But my protege mentioned that They went through the organization, you know, through the proper levels of leadership and whatever their reporting system is. And what they faced was comments like, well, nobody's ever said anything about this before. And I was livid because I'm thinking, this person is the only, okay? As the only, of course you haven't heard it before because nobody else is having that experience. And so I know as engineers, it's normal for us to look at numerical data and to think that we can only be informed by large N's and statistical significance. But I really, really want to emphasize, especially to leaders, that it is critically important to listen and learn about the experiences of the onlys in the room, of the onlys in the program, because those only voices do matter. And that might be explaining why they are the only and why we don't have more from a particular group or groups. And then in addition to that, you have to build the relationships. And part of this is recognizing that change cannot be born on the shoulder of a particular person or a particular group. And this goes back to the relegated and delegated part. Change and Jedi overall has to be everyone's responsibility. And so then when we're leading change, we recognize that we have to be able to communicate what the expectations are for people, for their responsibilities, for the behaviors, what accountability looks like, and how this is woven into the very core, into the very fabric of who we are as an organization. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap up so we'll have a bit of time for questions and answers. I want to thank you for your attention. And if you would like to connect with me, I'm at Dr. Y.E. Pearson on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can use the hashtag engineering change, and I'll probably see things that pop up related to that. And of course, the podcast is called Engineering Change, and it's focused on Jedi in engineering education at all levels. Thank you for your attention. And again, happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pearson. That was excellent. And we have received a steady stream of questions. So I'll go ahead and present those to you roughly in the order in which they came in. So one individual would like to know how we can combat the wrong perception that incorporating DEI equates to lowering standards.
Yes. This is one of my soapbox issues. Let me give it in terms of an example. So one of my projects has to do with mathematics accessibility. My team members designed and part of my team and I are studying the efficacy of an audio-based method of teaching and assessing mathematics. And the audio-based method was designed for students who are blind. There's also a visually adapted method, as a side note, that we've shown to work well for people with dyslexia and other print-related disabilities. So if I think about the students who are blind who we work with, and so there's blind and there's low vision. So I'm gonna go with students who are blind. If I go to one of those kids and hand them a printed piece of paper, the same printed piece of paper that I hand a sighted student, and I say, here, now answer this essay or do this work or whatever it is, and both students turn in the paper, looking at it through the lens of lowering standards by providing accommodations, or looking at it through the lens of the student who is blind having a deficit would say, well, the blind student didn't perform as well. When really it's that, no, the blind student was not given as a position to perform. The blind student was given a barrier. And so we have to look at, not that we're lowering standards, we are removing inequities. And so when we look at the research on, standardized testing, and see the years and years of research that have been done to show the inequities for students of color and for students from low-income backgrounds, when we look at the data that shows how under-resourced schools don't have the best teachers in the world, but they do have a lot of great teachers. I'm not going to try to disparage them, but they also don't have the same level of access to AP courses. They don't have the same access to computing equipment, coding courses, or whatever. And people are stepping back and saying that, well, the students don't have a potential, or we're lowering a bar by having an introductory coding class, or whatever it is. I think that's just completely missing the mark. And I really hope people will take some time and learn about some of these longstanding issues to hopefully change how they look at them. I think one of the things that has come out of this horrible pandemic we've been in is that more schools have gone to test optional admissions. And so now, where people say, well, we could never do admissions without the SAT score, well, now we were forced to. And so far, apparently we didn't stop admitting students. So can we start to look at things a bit differently? I think that we need to, and especially as engineers, we talk about being innovative. And usually that's something that's completely isolated from how we think about admissions, curricula, and all of these sort of things. And so I would want to challenge us as a community of engineering educators to be innovative in how we look at engineering education and STEM education more broadly.
Thank you. Following along those lines, we have a question from a student that I want to read. Thank you for encouraging us to move away from the deficit model when we think about diversity. One of my biggest pet peeves is the misconception that prioritizing diversity automatically means that we must lower our standards or the rigor involved with engineering. What types of alternative evaluation metrics can we use that don't rely on traditional things like SAT and GRE scores? And how do we convince those on the fence or opposed to JEDI to adopt those metrics? And thank you for your incredible presentation. And if I could just add to this also, maybe in hiring, this question pertains to admissions, but if you have any comments on hiring as well.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. One thing is to, well, let me take it to the context of something that a colleague of mine, or former colleague of mine, did that I thought worked really well. They managed a summer program for STEM students. And one of their goals was to not just sort of be business as usual with the students that the program would attract. And what they did was created an application process that was anonymized, so people couldn't jump to conclusions based on someone's name sounding feminine or sounding ethnic and all of that, and that carries over into the hiring part as well. They didn't use GPA or any of those measures, and the thing that they did was they gave the students essay prompts that were around things like, why do you want to be part of this program? And so it's focused on the student and their drive and their push for whatever it is that they were pursuing. And so that was one thing. The other thing I'll take to the context of a scholarship program that I managed. Um, this particular scholarship program, and it was at one of my previous institutions, I was very intent about allowing some flexibility in terms of the range of GPAs. Again, not thinking of it as lowering a bar by having a lower GPA, but recognizing that this pool of funding was by federal mandate, because that's where it came from, was to support students from low income backgrounds. And I knew in our community, because I had collected the data, I had done the M, okay, I knew a lot of our students had to work. So if I'm putting a student who has all the time in the world to focus on nothing but school, and a student who has to work 20, 30 hours a week and go to school, I don't expect that the student that's working 30 or 40 hours a week is spending as much time studying. It doesn't mean that student is less smart. It just means that student has other obligations that pulls them in a different direction. And so with that, we created a more flexible range of GPAs. And I targeted in the recruitment students who would be at the lower end of that range, because I'm like, those are the students who need it most in terms of the funding. Maybe we can give them enough funding that they can reduce their work hours and focus more on their studies. So again, it was about equity. And I remember during recruiting our first cohort, one of the measures that we had, and I will own this, we did have at the time, one of the metrics was the math SAT score. And I remember vividly having heated discussions over one student that some of the committee wanted to award, and some of us wanted to award, and some didn't. And we went back and forth, and I remember the most vocal person who didn't want it to award this student the scholarship was saying, well, students with SAT math scores in this range just don't succeed in engineering and this, that, and the other. And remember, I told you, looking at me on paper, that's the same discussion folks would have had about me. And so that makes me even more heated. And so I fought. The student was awarded the scholarship. And at that particular institution, it was not uncommon for the vast majority of students to finish their degrees in 5 years instead of 4. That student was one of 2 in our cohort who finished in 4 years with a stellar GPA, had offers for grad school, work wherever they wanted to go when they finished. On the flip side, there were students who looked perfect on paper who dropped out after the first semester. And so those are the sorts of things. And when we went back and started talking about, because as we saw that lower SAT math score student um, matriculate, we saw that they were a superstar. And what we saw was that that person had the determination that was driven by so much more than we could ever see on paper, that if only if they didn't have the money to go to school would they have not succeeded. And so we were able to do the money plus. And so that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of. And so for programs, and I've talked to some people about this recently, I just think we need to sit at the table and bring in our campus experts in these different areas and just completely rethink, re-image how we define this potential. On the hiring side, when I'm hiring for my team, I look for things to show up. But we do in our job announcements specify that we want faculty and staff who can work with teams and students from diverse backgrounds. And we make sure our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion is clear in the job announcement. My hope is that if you can't get with it, then it'll run you away and you won't apply. But I won't go down that road. But the thing is, when I'm hiring for my team, I look for things to show up organically, because I think that's when when that person really espouses and embodies it, it shows up that way. But I am in the process for just more general work. I am in the process of developing. So we have certain interview questions that get at that at a deeper dive, and there are certain things that I'm sharing with our departments at a meeting next month about how to look for different indicators in faculty and staff application materials.
That's great. If you release that to the public, you'll have a lot of interested readers here for that information. We have a lot more questions. I'm doubtful that we're going to get to them all, but there is a theme among several of the questions about how to promote the JEDI themes within the classroom. So I'd like to read you one that pertains to this. Thank you for such an excellent talk, Dr. Pearson. I have two questions. How can an instructor identify academic barriers versus hurdles in their own classroom? And the second part of the question is, what if a GSI notices such barriers in the course that they're working for, and how can that GSI or TA approach the course professor regarding these? Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing is, hopefully by now everybody's including language in their course syllabi that makes students aware of the availability of resources on campus if they need to register with an accessibility office, for instance, if they need an accommodation for class, that's on the radar. A couple of challenges with that. Number one is that oftentimes students won't register for such accommodations because there's a stigma that goes along with it. And we have research that shows engineering faculty and law faculty are the worst when it comes to attitudes toward accommodating students with invisible disabilities. And that's something that we need to overcome. Part of that, I believe, comes with education. And so the challenge with that is that the folks who seek out the education to do those things better are usually the ones who are already doing a good job and trying to do better. And the ones who need it the most are often not the ones to do it. And so a couple of things that can do there. First of all, if there is accountability built into the system so that there's an expectation expressed by the department or the school or college that says, we want everybody to be accountable for whatever aspects of JEDI, and so certainly an inclusive and equitable classroom is imperative. And so if in faculty evaluations, in promotion and tenure processes, if the question about what have you done comes up, it holds everybody accountable. The other thing is, if folks are really interested in making sure that their classrooms are equitable, inclusive, and accessible, certainly looking at resources offered by the Disabilities Opportunities Interworking Technology, I think is the T, it's the DOIT, DOIT Center at University of Washington. They have tons of resources on their website. They hold workshops. As a matter of fact, I just registered for another one of their workshops that's next week. And they have tons of workshops to talk about how you do these things. And the idea is this: if you design and implement courses, and I think a lot of people have been sort of forced to do this with this online learning paradigm, if we design and implement courses really in a manner that's really attentive to universal design for learning, we reduce or remove so many barriers for so many people that it definitely goes to that either removing barriers altogether or at least reducing them to hurdles. And then the need for accommodations can be not eliminated, but minimized, because you've already thought about a wide cross section of people when you designed your materials. And that doesn't only have to do with accessibility, that has to do with representation when you are showing information about the great work that other scientists and engineers have done. What does the representation among those people you celebrate look like? Can your students see themselves in those representations? So those are all things that we can all do. I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of the question. I might have answered it.
Yes, I definitely think you touched on most of it. The asker is asking for tips on what if someone who's assisting the professor notices a problem. Do you have recommendations for what they can do if they're in a GSI or TA role?
Yeah, the hope is that the professor is open so that if that TA goes to them and says, you know, I have a recommendation or I observed this. A lot of this, a lot of things can be uh, managed with a solid conversation at the start. And so it's not done where it's an attack mode or in I'm criticizing the way you run your class. It's, hey, I want to be helpful here. And so I think the approach is important.
Yeah, if you don't mind, maybe one more question. I realize we're 2 minutes over time. Is one more question okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Um, this ties into what you were just talking about as well as the example that you gave in your seminar related to frustration and trying to help a graduate student who's not being treated well by their advisor, but understandably doesn't want to come out publicly. Do you have advice for being helpful in that instance?
Yes, and this is something that I've seen, heard, and dealt with, and you know, the hope is that there's someone. I was talking to a group at Berkeley earlier this week, and this same question came up. And the advice I had for the student was, first of all, the recognition um, between the recognition of the difference between advisor and mentor. So the advisor says, you need to take these classes, you need to do this research, you need to publish these papers to graduate. A mentor is concerned about you as a whole person and not just as a student or a researcher. And so you have to make sure that you surround yourself with mentors, especially if your advisor isn't wearing the hat of a mentor. So make sure, because the self-care part of this is so critical. And that person, depending on the position that they're in, they may be in a position to advocate on your behalf. I know one thing that we have at our university, I'm not sure if you have it at yours, is we have a bias reporting system. So if it's something that's a bias or a discrimination or harassment or something like that, we have a system for reporting that. And the people reporting have the option to report it anonymously, or they report it, just make a full-blown report. And I work very closely with our director of access and equal opportunity. And so some of the conversations that we've had with faculty, staff, and students is that, and I've seen this in my research projects as well, sometimes we feel like we get to the point where the wrongdoing is so common that we think it's just a normal part of the way things are. And what our director always says is, if if nobody ever reports it, we can't fix it. And so if there's not this relationship where you can have that conversation, or if it's not that safety where you can have that conversation, and I get it, because not everybody has that level of safety with their advisor to be able to just have a sensitive conversation. But what our director pointed out was, it's if one person reports it and they think, well, I'm just sort of the lone voice in the wind. But when the university is looking at it, when they're looking at their monthly reports, and they start seeing ding, 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 the same issue showing up, whether it's in a particular department or centered around a particular person, then they have something they can use to say, there's a problem, we need to fix it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, again, and it goes back to the leadership, and it goes back to setting the expectations. of how we engage as a community, as an ecosystem of educators and learners and alumni and so forth. And so one of the things we're working on right now is, you know, not just a statement of core values, but also a code of conduct that has accountability measures built in for stakeholders at all levels. And so a lot of that is going to have to go to the systemic change. And that's outside of the student's direct hand to manage. But for that direct sort of personal bias, harassment, discrimination, or whatever's going on, I would hope that there's a reporting system or at least another mentor who you can go to, and also take care of yourself. Self-care is so critically important. So if there's a wellness center on campus where you can go and sit down and talk to a professional, don't think that it's only you, or don't think it's your fault. Take care of you, because that's the most important thing you can do.
That's really, really excellent advice. All layers of it. So thank you. And I just want to thank you for being so generous with your time today and staying for the extra few minutes. We did not really make a dent in the questions, but I understand it's time to let you go from this seminar. But thank you, Professor Pearson. It was an excellent talk, and we are really grateful to have heard from you today.